Morning Year 12. I hope you've all had a lovely weekend, and this week we're going to be starting a brand new unit, and it's one of my favourite. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I hope you're going to share that excitement with me, although no doubt you're just thinking, oh my god, it's another A-level unit. This is awesome. It's absolutely relevant to you. It's current, it's modern, it's super interesting, and it largely explains the shape of the political world today, which I think is pretty interesting, not least of all given everything that's happening around international relations at the moment between the US and China, the US and the UK, the US and just about everybody really, not to mention Russia's involvement, everything that's happening with Brexit, everything that's happening with Chinese investment in Africa. It's brilliant, it's fascinating, it's interesting. However, one important notice: if you're in school this week, you don't need to do this work. You'll be doing separate work in school with me, and then you'll be doing this work next week when you're back at home. So if you're in school, don't do the work I set on Teams, do the work in school instead, and do the work on Teams the following week. Okay, let's have a look through the work this week. This looks like a bit of a long one, but actually I just wanted to separate it into separate bullet points to hopefully make it a little bit more straightforward for you. So before we do that, let's just have a look at the overall spec for the new unit. So by the end of this unit, there are 4 key sections to it, and we're going to be starting to look at the first one today and over the next few weeks. But largely, you're going to be learning about the definitions of the political world map. So what makes a country a country? What makes a country independent? What is sovereignty? What are things like states and nations? We'll be looking at the fundamentals of the world geopolitical system. We'll also be looking at the concept of geopolitics as well. We'll also be looking at what are some of the current or modern challenges to the independence of countries around the world. So we call that sovereignty. Sovereignty being the power of a country, a nation state, to control its people and to control its own borders. So what are the challenges to this sovereignty, this independence of countries? We'll also be looking throughout the course of this unit at the idea of global governance. Now, global governance seems at first like a straightforward term, and it kind of is, but we'll be going into the details of it. Global governance is the world's collective attitude or response or set of actions to managing conflict. So it's the activities of multiple countries or organizations working together to manage conflict or reduce conflict. And we'll be looking at what role do countries and international institutions play in managing or reducing conflict in different formats around the world. And then finally, we'll be looking at how does that same idea of global governance, that work of multiple countries or bodies or organizations, how does global governance help maintain the independence of individual countries, nations and states around the world? Now, before we get into the specific tasks this week, this is really what you'll be answering. You'll be answering this question this week: how permanent are countries? And you're going to be doing some case study work and some research work to find out an answer to that question. So by the end of this week, you'll be able to explain what are some of the changes that affect countries, and you'll be able to explain that using some specific terminology that we're going to look at. So let's go back to our set of instructions for this week, and we can start explaining what I would like you to do. So the first thing you need to do, you're going to be using pages 263 to 267 for this week's work, and you're going to be sort of flicking around those. So let's go through your to-do list and make it a bit more specific, shall we? The first thing you need to do, we're going to be using a term throughout this entire unit called nation state. I want you to move away from using the term countries, and I want you to move towards using the term nation states instead of countries. So the first thing you need to do is to read the very first paragraph of this unit on page 263 and define the term nation state. Once you've defined that, we need to break it down, because I can see that in that term there is a hyphen, so nation state seems to be two separate things. And I would like you to read 265 to 267 and answer the following questions about states and about nations. Smash them together, you get a nation state. but you need to know the individual parts of that term to understand what a nation state is. So you need to know what they are. You need to answer these questions to explain how a state controls itself, what is state power, and what the word resilience means in relation to states. Also, you need to look at nations. What is a nation and how is it defined? How is a nation, importantly, different from a state? And why are nations not necessarily contained within the borders of a single state? So the super short summary of this is that a state is a government, a nation is a group of people. So for example, let's use France. The French state is the French government that controls the borders of France. They are based in Paris under the presidential decrees of President Emmanuel Macron, and that is the French state. Not to be confused with the French nation. A nation is a group of people who share a common identity or set of ideals. So whereas the French state is the French government that controls the borders of France, the laws, everything that happens within those borders, the French nation are the French people, the citizens of France that identify as French. So a nation state is when you put those two things together, so you get a state that controls a geographic area of land on the Earth's surface, and within that geographic area of land are a group of people with a common identity, the nation of France. Put those together, you get a nation state, and that's slightly different from the more basic term of a country. So you're going to go through these questions to be able to explain that in your own words and in slightly more detail than I've just gone through. Now, the more important part of this is you're going to use that knowledge. You're going to use that knowledge to explain how have the borders of our political planet, so the nation states, the countries and their people, how have the borders of our planet changed in recent times? So over, I don't know, the last 50 years or so. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to pick one of the following three examples of a geopolitical change. The breakup of Yugoslavia, which happened in the mid-90s following a whole number of decades of turmoil in Eastern Europe. German reunification. So you'll know that after the Second World War, Germany was split into West and East Germany, but now clearly that's not the case. So what happened to change that border? Or the formation of South Sudan. So in North Africa, Sudan and South Sudan, it's been a war-torn pair of nation states for the last, 20 odd years. But within the last decade, South Sudan became the world's newest country. So why is that? So once you've picked one of these three, Yugoslav breakup, German reunification, or South Sudan's formation, I would like you to do some research on the internet answering these three questions and this challenge, if you would like. So you need to be able to explain, when did the country's borders change? What were the key drivers of this change? Were they social, political, economic? And what were the impacts of these changes? So how were people affected? How was the economy affected? Largely, the environment, I've left it out of there because the world's physical environment hasn't been really impacted that much. However, politics, social, economic factors have changed hugely as a result of these geopolitical changes to our world map. There's also a challenge here to apply your new knowledge of your new case study to the idea of nation states. So how were nations affected and how were states affected by this change? So using German reunification as an example, if I went back to, East Germany in the 1950s, they would probably still consider themselves to be German. So you could argue that the nation of Germany, the German nation, the German people, they were still the same. However, the German state had been split in two, into East and West Germany, after the fall of Nazi Germany at the end of World War II. So you might want to think about how nations and states were affected by that change. Once you've done that, you need to complete your weekly quiz, which I'll put on Teams on Wednesday, and that will be based entirely on nation states and your case study. And then down here, I've added a whole bunch of resources for you. I've found mini documentaries for each of Yugoslavia, Germany and Sudan. There are a couple of Wikipedia pages and country profiles there for you. And I would suggest you use these as a starting point for your research and not all of it. And also, just out of interest, there's a brilliant Vox mini documentary on the border between India and Pakistan. So in the 1950s, as an aside, the India-Pakistan border was created entirely arbitrarily towards the very tail end of British colonialisation and colonialism. And as some of you might know, there are huge geopolitical and conflict issues between India and Pakistan, a huge number of which stem from the fact that the Brits just decided, well, we're just going to carve up this bit of land and say one of these is India and one of these is Pakistan, without any real regard for the people that lived there. So you might want to have a look at that. It's a really interesting video. It's absolutely relevant to what we're doing, but you don't have to watch that. So there's your explanation of what you need to do this week. I'm just going to have a quick talk now for a couple of minutes through the differences between nations and states. So you might want to hang around for that. So let's have a quick talk through these two slides. And I've put this entire PowerPoint on Teams for you as well. So when you're looking at states, you need to be able to think about their key characteristics. So what makes a state, what makes the French state different from the German state, for example? You need to think about, why is there inequality between states? Clearly, we know that the US is the global superpower. They're being increasingly challenged by China. But why is it that America is such a strong country, and why it's globally recognized as the global superpower? Why is it that some states have more power and others have less? And this picture here, it might be to do with the economy. So the US has pretty huge economy compared to the rest of the world. Could be to do with military, could be to do with culture as well. So US culture, we watch US TV, we consume US media, we know US fashion trends and YouTubers. So think about how that might also link to the idea of resilience. And in the textbook, you'll see something called the Fragile States Index, which shows the resilience of different nation states. But what on earth is that measured on? And then if you're looking at nations, so remember, a state is the government, the controlling body of an area of land and its people. A nation is to do with the people that live there, or a group of people with one identity. As an example, some of you might know that Cornwall in the southwest of the UK has a huge local patriotic identity. So there's an idea of the Cornish nation. Cornish people that identify not as British, but as Cornish. Now, do the Cornish nation, the group of people that identify as Cornish, do they have a state? Do they have their own independent government with control over their own borders? Clearly not. Even though some people ridiculously want to make Cornwall an independent country, which would never work, the Cornish nation strongly identify they're not a nation state because they don't have a controlling government which has independence and can successfully control its own area of the Earth's surface. Now, the Cornish nation are not the only example, and we'll be going into more detail in this in future weeks, but you might want to cast your mind back to Changing Spaces, Making Places. We looked at the Kurdish nation, so how Kurdish people, for an example, have created their own part of the world, but they don't really control it. They have no controlling state. They're a group of people spread across multiple countries, but they strongly identify as Kurdish. So one final thing there, as I continue rambling through this, is the idea that the vast majority of countries, of nation states on our planet today, are not mono-ethnic. So mono meaning one, ethnicity being your ethnicity. So most countries on the planet are do not consist of one single ethnicity. Use London as an example for the UK. We live in one of the most diverse places on the planet. The UK, the United Kingdom, is home to a huge number of people However, we're still considered to be a nation state. We are the British nation state, even though we've got people from all over the world. So you might want to consider, while you're looking through the textbook and doing your research, why is it that most modern countries that actually have people from a huge number of different nations are called nation states? And then one final diagram for you, the idea that in this Venn diagram you've got states on one side, nations on another. What is it that connects those two things? So remember, if you have any questions, please email me or Mr. Ranson. You could also put a question on Teams. Please let me know if you have any trouble with this. I really look forward to seeing you guys in school over the next couple of weeks, and I hope you get on with this work really well. Cheers very much, guys. Have a great week.